this is going to be, I think, just a great endeavor. What happened is, about a month ago, the Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehab published an article that talked about the most cited articles in rehabilitation over the last, was it a couple decades? 50 years. I mean, since the 70s, some of them were cited. So it's been a while. And what happened is I had read the article, and Molly and I were talking, and she said, I said, did you know that Richard Bohannon, his article was cited number 2 out of 100 articles? And I said, I know Richard Bohannon. I said,
for better or worse.
For better or worse, exactly. He's written over 400 articles, and I really think his articles are very, very solid, good research, but they have an excellent clinical component. And so we were talking, and Molly said, it'd be kind of fun is if we could talk to Richard about the research, ask questions that a clinician might want to know about research, and really dissect it so that everybody felt real comfortable, could use the concepts in clinical practice, but really understand how he got to that research, how he developed the program, and what they can use from that. So that's what we're going to do today. The very first thing I would like to do is go over that article in the Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. It came out in May 2010, and it talked about the most cited articles, and it listed 100 articles. It went through a citation analysis of how they picked those articles, all right? And what that means is that somebody who was going to write another article used, for example, Dr. Bohannon's article, all right? And so much that it became in the top 10, actually number 2. Then they talked about what makes a classic article. And a classic article is any article that's been cited over 100 times. So that means that, and they had in there how many citations yours had. You don't remember it offhand, do you?
It's actually over 1,000 now, but I don't think that's the number in the article.
Okay, yeah, so over 1,000 people cited his article. So when I see that, it's an article worth reading. And just for your information, I'm just going to go over the top 5 because I found that pretty fascinating. The first one was Fairbank's article about the Aus-Westry Disability Scale. And that was number 1. Sorry, you were only number 2. Number 2 was Dr. Bohannon's, and he talked about the Modified Ashworth Scale, which is the very next article we're going to go over when we get into the kind of the meat of this course. And then we went into Dr. Moritani and DeVries's article that talked about neural hypertrophy versus muscle hypertrophy. And I was lucky enough to be able to work with Dr. DeVries when I got my master's degree in gerontology. He had this great research laboratory, mostly on rats. But actually, Dr. Bohannon uses people. But his was mostly rats. And again, that was number 3. So again, a lot of these have sort of this, function aging theme. Then was Dr. Taub's article on constraint-induced movement. And that's a pretty hot topic. His article came out in 1993, Moritani and DeVries, 1985, Richard Bohannon's article, 1987, Aus-Westry was done in 1980. And finally, the last one, 1985 again, was Mathiowis tip and grip norms for the adult population. So these are the top 5 that people really went back to, decided this is the basis of what we're going to do. All right, so that kind of gives you a little background about the article that sort of sparked our interest. And Molly, did you want to say something about kind of pulling research with clinical, what we're trying to do here?
Well, I think that oftentimes the lives of the clinicians are just so separate from the life of a researcher. And researchers tend to do both, but clinicians have their hands full. And so it's really hard for them to keep up to date with what's going on. So I thought, let's talk to really famous, fabulous researchers who, and they can explain what is important about their research, because sometimes research articles, the way we have to write them, can be a little tedious for a clinician to actually get the meat of. And so I want to look at these research articles that are classic, and what is it that clinicians can learn from them, and how can they learn to treat their patients in ways that are going to be most helpful, and learn from the research.
Evidence-based.
Evidence-based. It's all kinds of evidence. Let's go for the best evidence that's out there. There's so many research articles, so we're trying to look at the key ones that can really affect practice and really affect how helpful they are for clinicians.
Good. That's great. All right, so you want to get into some of the questions that we have, sort of. Again, this piece is going to be an introduction, kind of get you behind the mind of Dr. Bohannon. So, very first thing that I thought I would ask is, what do you like about being a researcher?
Well, you get to answer questions, and I think I've always been interested in that. And I think questions that, for which there can be application. Most of my research is on measurement type things, one way or another. And I think for a lot of people, they just want something used to treat somebody. But unless you really know what it is you're dealing with, you're not even sure whether you should be treating it or not, or what you should be treating. So I've found it interesting for years, and it was encouraged earlier in my career, if you will, by certain people that measurement is important. Derek Wade among them, I think, with whom you're familiar, and Steve Rose, with whom you'd be familiar as well. So I guess it's sort of one thing led to another, and that's what I've been doing.
I think that's great. Now, I can't stress what you just said enough, that people want to get right to the treatment piece, and for example, spasticity. How can you treat spasticity if you haven't measured it? And so it's that piece is very, very important, and we're hoping that the audience will get a real sense that the measurement is what leads to the treatment, and that's so imperative in what we do. So great.
How do we know that what we're doing is really making a difference unless we can accurately measure it? So treatment modalities are important, but being able to measure whether or not they're working, that's really critical.
Yeah. And even there's a little need for humility, because just because they get better and our measurements will tell us that, doesn't necessarily mean it was
all
we who did it.
That's true. Actually, Dr. Fishman, who's a friend of mine up in New York, had a great quote. He said, Socrates said, the unevaluated life is not worth living, and unevaluated therapy is not worth giving. So I really like that, and it's true. And he said that, back in 1980, when we weren't really measuring what we're doing. At least now, I think therapists are measuring. And I think what we're trying to do today is look at what some of those measures are. All right, well, let's go on to the next one. It says, does he conduct research because he's curious by nature, or does he want to improve the practice of physical therapy? All right, we talk to people, and this is some of the questions if they were here with you, what they would ask.
I think it's both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah? All right. So in the sense of the curiosity, these are just things that have come up when you do, because you said you do clinical practice.
Yes.
So for example, you look at the Ashworth, or time balance scores. Did you find and I know your big area is working in stroke rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. Did you find that this was something that you came across a lot, and you said, wow, why, what are we using to measure this?
Well, it's always something that provokes it. I think if you look at something like the Ashworth scale, it's the one that the article cited is the modified. Well, that means that someone else came up with it first,
right.
Which is Ashworth, and I believe it was with multiple sclerosis. Another diagnostic group for whom spasticity can be an issue. And it seemed to me it was not sensitive enough at the lower end of the scale, and maybe we'd be missing the opportunity to really capture some changes that occurred in people. So maybe we should make it a little more sensitive by adding sort of an interim step between two of the other sort of scores. So curiosity, it certainly had a patient basis. But a curiosity too in terms of if modifying that kind of thing would prove the measurement to be more useful.
Yeah.
So when you're treating someone, or numbers of people, all of a sudden you just get this idea that, gee, maybe I could do this better. Maybe there's a better way to measure this. Maybe there's a better way to treat this. And so research is your way to answer these questions that come up. So I think that any profession needs to encourage questioning at all levels. And I think that that's going to make the whole profession so much better. So I commend your curiosity. And then following through with it, it's like, well, gee, I wonder if this would work. And then let's see if it does.
Well, a good opportunity of that is something called explicatory experiments. That's when you just kind of modify a little something to see its effect. And so there are a number of things we've done, particularly with muscle performance, where that's the case. Remember the stuff when you're in school, like about AT&R, or maybe it's like Usain Bolt or something, But the idea was you turn your head, it's going to change things. But we checked that out in healthy people and in people with stroke, and it didn't make a difference in the measurable force. Now, that doesn't mean I haven't seen a patient or two who, for truly, that made a difference. But if that's the case, it's not something which generalizes in a strong way. So you see something, you've read something or heard something, and you try it out to see. So we've done that and a number of other things.
Yeah.
Just because
That's
of
a
an
great
encounter.
one. See, I didn't know that. That's a great
There
one.
you go. It's one of the 400 or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, it is. Okay, I missed that one. No, and just one more final point on that. I think it's so important because you say you're curious and you follow through. And I was having this discussion with some therapists today that frequently in our profession, we kind of go by the rules, and it's hard for us to be open to the change and to someone saying, maybe try it this way or maybe look at it this way. And that's why it's important to have research to give people a little bit of support to go in a different direction. You learn things in school, you're supposed to do it this way, but let's say you went to school 10 years ago, how much research has come out in those last 10 years that can completely change how you would practice today. And so we're asking you to be open. I know you learn things certain ways, but be open to kind of taking the research in, slowly integrating it into your practice. I think that's what makes a better clinician.
I do too.
All right, well, we got a couple more questions. Is the pace of translating research into practice something that frustrates you?
Frustrate would be a strong term.
Okay.
I guess if I had my druthers, realizing that there's a lot of reasons it doesn't translate, which are understandable. But if it was up to me, I would certainly like to see some of this information out there, whether it has to do with measurements that we can apply in the clinic or interventions that is more broadly applied. But sometimes something's a great idea, but it's not practical. So you either don't have the equipment or it's really not the right setting to do it.
Right.
I mean, we're not going to do probably constraint-induced therapy with someone in an ICU.
Right.
Or we're not going to try to put them on a weight-unloaded treadmill under those circumstances. But there are places, if someone can make it to an outpatient clinic, where that's, I think, pretty well supported.
Right, very well.
So it's just a lot of
Can't do it in
specifics.
The home. Carry your constraint-induced movement.
Actually, I tried, but I'm doing the unloading. They've got a bell around them, and I'm doing a curl with about 100 pounds here to try and unload them. And but that's few and far between, the number of folks.
Very
and it's a good way to get a workout. So.
I love it. Okay. Yeah, no, and so that's good. Did you want to say anything?
No, that's nailed.
All right, so here's a great one. What 3 pieces of advice do you have for clinicians?
Zeal is not enough, love is not enough, and zeal and love combined are a good approach.
Okay.
We used to have folks, for example, that would come through rehab, and we would call them a NL-NARC, needs love but not a rehab candidate. In other words, you care about them, you want them to feel loved. Like NL-NARC, needs love but not a rehab candidate.
And that's great.
So it's not that you don't care about them, it's not that you don't want to do good things, but quite frankly, I'm not really sure there's any good I can do for you.
Right.
And that's really frustrating. In fact, some of the research we've done, it's like, wow, this is supposed to make a difference, but we did a meta-analysis not long ago on shoulder positioning for stroke, and you really couldn't show from any of these articles that they could prevent these people from developing impairments in range of motion. Now, I'd love to have an intervention where you could do that,
right.
But and maybe it's better to do something than nothing. In fact, there probably is some evidence to that effect. But it is what it is.
Right.
And so I don't think we want to oversell ourselves either.
Right.
All the more reason to research.
Right.
Come up with something that does work.
Exactly. And figure out what works.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that were, the clinical prediction rules that are coming out now that are saying we should do this and not that. Things you learned. You spend so much time in school learning. Now you should know what they are, but don't do them because they don't do anything.
Right.
So, that's a great place. Great point.
And I think along those lines, particularly for interventions, you're going to have some people who respond and some people who don't respond. And sort of trying to come to an understanding of why some people are responders and why some aren't. A recent study on obesity, for example, found, as I recall, I read a lot so I don't recall the specifics, or maybe I dreamed it.
Okay.
But my recollection was that, so they had all these people that were on this intervention, and then they looked at those who did a better job of losing weight and those that didn't. What happened is those who weren't particularly good responders, during the time they weren't engaged in the intervention, were more sedentary. So you can see in terms of the overall intake-output balance, it wasn't just what they were doing, but what was happening while they weren't working with them.
Right.
So I think that whole issue of response is an important one.
Yeah, and that's a good one too. All right, now if a clinician wanted to ever go into research, is there any advice to sort of gently lead them into research?
Start simple.
Okay.
Yeah. Don't make too big a deal of something. And as my wife would say sometimes, bless her heart, she'll say, yeah, he's published 400 articles, but it's not like he's found the cure for cancer. You know? And she's absolutely right, you know. But I don't have the resources nor probably the brain power to find a cure for cancer. Not that I'm sure anyone will in such a global way. But there are things which are interesting that one can do in a clinical setting, whether it be a single case or something where you're looking at a measurement, which I do a lot of, or looking at these sort of explicatory experiments, as I said, where you're looking at the effect of some little thing on how people perform. A good example is Stefan Hesse. He looked at people walking with stroke, whether there was a difference in them walking, I think, barefoot versus with a shoe versus an AFO. And he just switched up the order of doing those as you would want to, and found out they did better with a shoe and an AFO than they did with a shoe, which was better than no shoe. And I mean, that certainly has major implications.
Yes.
And it's not like you're taking a muscle biopsy,
right.
You know, or tying an arm up,
right.
You know, 24 hours a day.
Yeah, and it's useful information.
Absolutely.
And things that you need to have.
Start simple.
Yeah, start simple. So see if you have a simple idea.
How receptive do you think that faculty are to a physical therapist saying, I've got a really interesting idea, I've got a question. I was wondering if maybe somebody at the university would be interested in working with me. Sometimes pairing up with people might work. Do you think that that's done very often? I
think it is done. I think there's probably some very good examples of that. But that's one of those things easier said than done. Yeah, it's. I think it's ideal if you have, clinicians that have a little bit of research background, and you have researchers or academics, if you will, that really still have an interest and hand in clinical things. Then rather than the sort of Venn diagrams, we got two circles which are maybe just banging up against each other. You got a little bit of overlap, talk each other's language, and can understand the realities and possibilities. I've had a lot of ideas I've shared with clinicians that just really never get off the ground. But if you're there and a part of it, sort of walking alongside them, as opposed to giving them something to do, I think it makes a big difference.
And again, I think a nice way to start is a single subject or even a case study. Those kind of things are an interesting way to get yourself published initially, and then you could try to go a little heavier into the research.
Well, still the key is the measurement, because our students used to do a lot of case studies, and I think one of the biggest weaknesses that I'd seen what they brought back was things they didn't measure. And so I'd say, how do you know that? Well, why didn't you do so-and-so? Well, they didn't have one of those at that clinic, or no one did that there. So, well, here's a great opportunity, easier said than done, to be the change agent, to be a zealous lover, or whatever. We're trying to do the right thing and being willing to be different or that kind of thing.
Yeah. See, that's where I think that sometimes pairing up with somebody who has a strong research background, who can give you a few pointers. Like, I want to study this, and how do you think I should go about it? And it doesn't take that much time of the faculty member's time, but to spend hours, days, weeks on something, and then a professor says, well, it has so many holes in it that could have been solved early on. So if you can...
It's easy to be a critic.
Yeah.
But some of those holes are pretty gaping sometimes.
Yeah, I know. But if you have a research design person, a statistician, somebody to help you, I think that's nice.
But again, I think even being in the clinic, I do some work with All Star Therapy as they contract to provide services, and so I brought in this handheld dynamometer, something we may talk about later on. And you have people go, "What's that? Never seen one of those," or somebody else say, "I think we went over that in class one time, but I've not seen one since," or whatever. So I'm doing this, and then a couple of days later, one of the other therapists came up to me and said, "The OTs are having tool envy," So I thought that was great. They really thought it was neat. And so then I can explain to them what it showed us. One of the ladies had a person with Parkinson who was having a hard time getting out of a chair. And I was able to say, well, the big problems with these folks, of course, are their rigidity, or their tremor, or their bradykinesia. But, the research pretty well shows they can be weak also. So, and we know they have some motor control problems in terms of their center of mass as they go to stand. But I said, it could be that a lot of it's just weakness. So I was able to measure her strength and they say, well, it doesn't surprise me at all that she can't get up. Even if she didn't have these other problems, based on what we know, I would expect her to have difficulty. Right. But that's where you're kind of in there with the clinicians doing something, hopefully piquing their interest.
Right. That's great. All right, another one. What do you think about having your article be in the top 10 cited articles?
They like it at the university.
Yeah.
I tell my wife about
I hope they
it.
gave you a big bonus.
Yeah, not on the basis of that alone, I'm sure. But no, and I certainly shared it with my wife Lucy, and she's happy for me. And so it's good to be recognized. It's good to know that what you've done has not been done in vain. But again, it's not the cure for cancer. And I think doing a kind deed for someone, and particularly of the right sort for the right person, may be more important than having 1,000 citations of an article.
Okay. All right.
So
Yeah, but it was a good thing.
it is.
All right. Well, I think that's it.
Okay, that's a good introduction to what
okay.
we're going to be getting into next.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.